Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you. This morning we're going to hear from Mr. Inwood.
Yeah.
Yep. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could you give your full name, please?
Paul Inwood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Inwood. In front of you, you should have a witness statement.
Yep.
Is that witness statement, dated on the final page, the 15th of May 2023?
It is, yeah.
And is that your signature on that page?
It is.
And is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Thank you very much. That witness statement has the unique reference number of WITN 057801000. That witness statement will be published on the inquiry's website in due course. Mr. Inwood, you worked for the Post Office for a period of over 30 years.
That's
is that
correct.
Right? I think you started as a postal officer serving customers in a Crown Post Office branch.
That's correct, yeah.
You were assistant branch manager and then manager. You became area manager. Between 2002 and 2004, you were the contracts manager for the eastern side of southeast England. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
And then you held a number of different roles: rural development manager, contracts development manager. The most significant for today's purpose is 2011 to 2018. You were contracts and policy development manager.
Yeah, I believe those are the dates, yeah.
Thank you. Can you briefly describe that final role for us?
There was two parts to that. The first part was to develop policies that would support people within the company in terms of managing day-to-day issues that would happen in a postmaster's life cycle. For example, insolvency, death in service. And those policies were developed either upon demand from internal clients or because I noticed that there was a sort of gap in the current approaches, possibly caused by statute or other gaps in the way that we were managing the relationship with postmasters. The second part was to develop either variations to the existing contracts, and I refer to like the traditional contracts, which were the sub-postmaster contract and variants of that, or to develop new contracts for postmasters, normally in response to like a set-piece business transformation program, such as network change or network transformation.
Thank you very much. Could I ask, you're a little bit quiet. Could you possibly come slightly closer to the microphones? Right. Not on top of them, but slightly closer. Thank you. Can you tell us where in the post office hierarchy did that role sit?
It was a senior manager's role, but it was the people I were reporting into, were probably sort of 2 to 3 steps removed from the exco.
And can you give us examples of who it was that you were reporting into during that period?
Latterly, it was Nick Beale, who managed the agents development team that looked after postmasters' remuneration and the contract and policy developments. Craig Tuthill, similar, but he was looking after similar level, but he was looking after the contracts team. That is the contracts advisors that would deal with the day-to-day postmaster issues.
And did you have any cause to liaise with those higher up in the executive, for example?
No.
I want to start by asking you about what we know as Legacy Horizon and the early years of Horizon. Can we please turn to POL 00006666, please? This is a document that I'm going to come back to a number of different times today. Okay. So just to assist us, can you tell us what this document is?
I can't see it on the screen.
it should hopefully come up on your screen. Oh, this may be the second time it's happened. It may not be turned on. Somebody's running over
Okay.
to assist.
Thank you. It's on now. Yeah, it's green lights on.
Can you see it on your screen now?
Yeah.
So it's a document we'll return to a number of times this morning.
Okay.
Can you assist us with the circumstances in which you came to be talking to a solicitor at Womble Bond Dickinson?
I think this is what was referred to as the witness proofing statement that was taken in, I think, January 2018 in advance of the group litigation order.
And it looks as though you were sitting down with somebody called Victoria Brooks, who was a managing associate at Womble Bond
That's
Dickinson.
correct, yeah.
And what was the purpose of the meeting?
I think the purpose of the meeting was for them to ask me a whole bunch of questions about my experiences in the company and to see the extent to which that would be helpful with Paul's position in the group litigation.
Were you involved in the group litigation outside of this?
No.
2018 is also the year, I think, that you left the post office.
That's correct.
Is there any connection between the group litigation and
No.
matters and your departure?
No.
Can we please turn to page 64? Are you able to assist us with why you left the post office?
Contract came to an end.
I'm going to take you through a page and a half of the transcript between yourself and the solicitor. I'm going to start about halfway down. And it's where PI is yourself and VB is Victoria Brooks of Womble Bond Dickinson. You say there, my understanding is the advent of automation, at least in the directly managed estate, improved that situation. And that was the situation about the difficulty adding certain figures up, etc. And then she says, yeah. And you say, you know. And she says, did you find it to the extent that you've used it? How did it compare to the manual system? And you say, it was less reliance on mental processing because, you push a button and the system works out the balance due to the customer. Sorry, could we just stay on page 64? Sorry, I'm going to start actually slightly higher up. About halfway. Could we zoom out slightly? Yeah, it's halfway down there, so I'm going to start slightly higher up. It's my understanding is the advent of automation, at least in the directly managed estate, improved the situation because, all right, if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. And she says, yeah. And you say, because, all right, if you put, and then you say, but a calculator is less inclined to make mental mistakes than a human being. And she says, yeah, that's true. And effectively, Horizon is a calculator. Just pausing there, calculator is a description we've heard before, and it's a description we'll hear again today. Where did that description come from?
I think when automation was introduced into the Crown Post Office estate, there was evidence that the shortages were reduced because of that. So my understanding was that the advent of automation would result in fewer discrepancies.
But a calculator is a very simple It can be very simple. It can be used by children.
It's a simplification of something that's more complicated. Yeah.
And where do you think that term came from? Was that a term that your colleagues used? Was
Yeah, it's one that I'd heard used internally.
And then if we go below that, it says, did you ever work in branch? Something Horizon was installed. I've forgotten the timeline. And you say, I did, because what I used to do when I was an area manager was to go out at Christmas, and because BMs, I think that's PMs, must be, were too busy to talk, branch manager, and to be visible, I would go and work the counter alongside a colleague. And I still do that, actually, but in a slightly different way. So I had used Horizon, and it was a brilliant system.
Yeah, BMs is an abbreviation of branch manager. Yeah.
Thank you.
Not post. It's not PM.
Branch manager. Thank you.
Yeah.
You described Horizon there as a brilliant system. Can you assist us with how it was that in 2018 you still considered Horizon to be a brilliant system?
Well, I'd used it personally, and I'd not encountered any problems using it. That said, I'd never completed a balance at the end of the week around that time. As I said, we would go out in times of Christmas pressure and execute transactions using Horizon. So it wasn't perfect, but I'd found it fairly intuitive to use.
So you would place entries onto the system, but
Yes.
you wouldn't ever balance the system?
You may do a cash declaration at the end of the day, but not check all of the stock, so that you know that there hadn't been a major problem caused by me during the day.
So the comment that it was a brilliant system is based on occasional use,
Yeah.
and occasional use that doesn't involve the Wednesday balancing.
Yeah, and obviously it wasn't made with the benefit of hindsight.
She says, yeah, you say, she says, did you find it, to the extent that you've used it, how did it compare to the manual system? And you say, it was less reliant on mental processing because, you push a button and the system works out the balance due to the customer. She says, yeah, that's true. And if we go over the page, and from the customer, but it also reminds you what you have to take from them or give to them in terms of the products. Yep. So in my view, it was a real watershed, yep, in the way that we interface with the customer. Okay. And we save time because at the end of weekly balancing procedures were much quicker. So if you had a postmaster, I think it's quite intuitive. So again, that comment has to be taken in the context that you hadn't actually completed a weekly balancing procedure.
Earlier on, when I was a branch manager, then there would be weekly balancing of individual stock units, and there would be a cash account produced, which is an amalgam of the accounts for all of the stock units. But that was in an automated environment pre-Horizon.
Yes, and your reference there to saving time because the balancing procedures are much quicker, it wasn't because you had actually used Horizon and carried that out yourself. That was...
No, it was anecdotal.
Anecdotal.
Yeah.
Why did you think that it was much quicker?
Because I think when automation was introduced into the Crown and the agent's estate, the narrative was that there were time savings in the production of the weekly cash account. When I was doing manual accounts, you could easily be there an hour and a half to 2 hours on a Wednesday evening. And I think in the Crown estate, efficiency savings were made when automation was introduced. So it would be reasonable to think that it was quicker when automation was introduced into the agency estate.
You described it as the narrative. Where was that coming from?
There were business efficiency teams within Pole, and you would hear about savings that had been made in the Crown Post Office estate, and anecdotally from postmasters that it was faster to produce not just the balance but the weekly cash account in an automated environment.
So you've described there the weekly balancing being quicker and that it's quite intuitive. This inquiry has heard quite a lot of evidence to the contrary. Long periods of time on, for example, the helplines, unhelpful helplines, difficulty with actually using the system, putting aside bugs, errors and defects, just pressing wrong keys and things like that. Were you not familiar with those kinds of complaints in 2018?
Well, I didn't receive complaints directly, but where there were discrepancies in accounts, then clearly it could take longer to bottom out those discrepancies, or sometimes the discrepancies wouldn't be resolved at that point, and therefore the postmaster would have to roll over into another balancing period and accept those discrepancies at that point and hope that an error notice or a transaction correction would come back.
So where you've said the balancing procedures were quicker, in fact, what you mean really is the pressing the button to calculate the total is quicker, but there could be a whole host of problems with that process.
If everything went okay, it would be quicker. If things didn't go okay and there was a discrepancy, then clearly that would take some remediation to get to the bottom of that, and therefore it would not have been quicker.
Did you think about that at this time when you were answering these questions? Was that something on your mind?
No, not reacting to the questions that were put to me, no.
You then said, I've never seen in the evidence that it was inaccurate. It's a calculator plus, and it does a whole lot more than that. Obviously, you know, why would our EPOS be inaccurate and no one else's is? Just pausing there, how would you know that nobody else's EPOS system was inaccurate?
Well, just speaking from personal experience, I'd not received or couldn't recall any evidence that there was a problem with the EPOS.
But you're referring there to nobody else's being inaccurate. Are you referring to other companies that use an EPOS system?
Yeah.
Did you consider, for example, whether other companies prosecuted on the basis of data produced by the EPOS system?
Not at that point, but I'd had meetings with other franchisors, and didn't seem to be any evidence that they'd had these problems with their EPOS systems, because we would often talk about their approaches to contract breach.
Who do you have in mind?
McDonald's was one example.
And did McDonald's prosecute on the basis of data provided by their EPOS system?
Do they?
Yes.
But if there are problems internally, I would imagine they would, but I've not seen any evidence of that.
I mean, looking back at this account here, do you think that you gave enough thought there to the implications of relying on the EPOS system and its comparison with a company like McDonald's?
Not in the moment.
And how about now?
Well, over the last 2 or 3 years, I've read a lot that's now in the public domain regarding the integrity of the Horizon system. And at various points, I've tried to think back of specific examples where I'd seen evidence that it was unreliable.
Yes. One task for this inquiry is really to understand why in 2018 people from the post office in quite senior roles like yourself considered that Horizon was a calculator and that why would your system be inaccurate if nobody else's is? Where does that mindset come from? What was it within the company that was telling you that?
I think there was a narrative internally that spoke to the integrity of the system, and the narrative was that the system was robust.
And can you tell us where that narrative was coming from?
Fairly senior levels in the company, but it was discussed broadly at my level when I had meetings with the contracts team. There was never any suggestion that discrepancies at audit had been caused by the system.
Are you able to assist us in particular with anybody in particular who you had those kinds of conversations with, who reassured you?
It's quite difficult to think back for specific individuals. I'm talking about a large community where there was almost like a corporate groupthink that the system was robust but not foolproof. Sometimes the system would crash. That was happening back when I was a contracts manager, 2002 to 2004. Data could be lost in the event of that happening. So it clearly wasn't completely foolproof, but nor was there any trend of cases that I'd seen where the EPOS system had caused phantom discrepancies in people's accounts.
And where you say trend, I mean, how was it that people would prove that to you?
Well, there was never any attempt to prove a negative, that the system was completely foolproof, and there were no examples. There were from time to time examples where data was lost to do with power outages or the equipment crashing, that there would have to be some attempt at remediation of the postmaster's accounts.
Did you not receive complaints over the years from sub-postmasters that there were more significant problems with Horizon?
When, over the 2 or 3 period where information entered the public domain regarding the flaws in the system, and when I completed your questionnaire, I thought back long and hard for specific examples where it had been put to me directly that a discrepancy had been caused by the system, and I couldn't think of any specific examples at those points in time.
And can you think of examples now?
I can, because I've seen one that was disclosed to me quite late this week, where there was an email exchange around one specific case where the postmaster had claimed that the discrepancy was caused by Horizon. And I've obviously read that there were hundreds of other claims that emerged during the course of the group litigation and beyond that.
Yes, but in terms of your personal knowledge, you're saying there was one occasion when there was a complaint made about the system.
I can think of one, but that's only because that I saw an email exchange in the bundle.
And which one was that?
I can't remember the name of the post office.
It may be that we come to it. I'm going to just read on a few more lines. She says, can I ask you what do you think the biggest weakness in Horizon is from your experience? And you say, I think there are probably too many screens to get through to get to what you want it to do. Sometimes it's awkward to remember where things are, and in order to get to where you want to go, you have to remember which screen you have to go through. You know, the printer was probably too slow and noisy, but we're improving it, and it has changed a lot recently. I think there's no major issue with it, really. She says it's interesting to speak to somebody about that who has got experience of both. I don't think anyone would want to go back to a manual. And then you say that's what we should ask them, shouldn't we? Or she says that's what we should ask them, shouldn't we? We should ask sub-postmasters, do they want to go back to that? So in this discussion, 2018, you hadn't recalled that one occasion when a complaint had been made about the system?
No, I had not.
Were you in any way playing things down in this conversation with the lawyer?
No, I was just responding to their questions.
Can we also bring up your witness statement? So WITN 05780-100, please. We've talked a little bit about using the system and difficulties that some sub-postmasters may have had using the system. Can we look at paragraph 23, please? And that is page 4. Thank you. Paragraph 23, you say you do not feel that any improvements could be made to the training given to sub-postmasters. Do you still think that that's correct?
Based on my experience during the period of time I was in the company, I wouldn't change that.
Could we please look at poll 000938184? This is a letter to you from somebody called Lawrence Green. Is that somebody that you remember?
I hadn't, but I've got a vague recollection of this when I read it this week.
Can you remember who he was at all?
I think he was either he was probably a postmaster.
And he is there writing to you following an NFSP Eastbourne branch meeting. Does that assist you at all? Might he have been a representative of some sort, or is
He may well have been.
This was 2004, so you were contracts manager for the eastern side of South East England.
Yeah, that was I think coming to the end of my period of time was the contracts manager, yeah.
Thank you. If we could scroll down to the bottom of this page. He says at the very bottom, most like me have received no system training from the post office throughout their careers. In 24 years, accepting various sales training initiatives and a laptop-based, over the page again, thank you, product knowledge evening, my total system training amounted to 1 day for Horizon, plus 2 assisted balances when Horizon went live. When I took on my first office in 1980, I learned from a fellow postmaster and paid for his help. Pausing there, were you aware, therefore, of historic complaints of training concerns, even pre-Horizon?
I think from time to time, postmasters, or I would identify a capability issue with a postmaster as opposed to an integrity issue. And from time to time, I would ask either the training team or perhaps one of the field team just to give them a bit of extra support, you know.
He says their 2 newly appointed postmasters were in attendance and they advised that they had been made aware of and had been trained in the zero balancing system on appointment and followed this system. Can you tell us what was the zero balancing system?
No, I don't know what he's referring to. Perhaps it's that you have to balance the accounts and accept discrepancies identified by the system. That's a guess.
He says, I advised that you had stressed that there's only one policy universally applied and that no one postmaster could be allowed to be an exception. It says, 15 members reported that they had not been trained in, nor were they aware of the requirement for zero balancing. All reported that if a discrepancy occurs during a holiday, it is not adjusted by the locum, but is dealt with on the postmaster's return. Also, they operate the old system of showing any discrepancy in the final cash account and then making it good. They were dismayed that they could be disciplined and threatened with loss of contract for not using a procedure of which they, like me, were unaware and in which they are untrained. So that's 15 members from your region complaining about difficulties, a lack of training. Do you recognise those complaints at all?
I think that part of the South East was managed by a different contracts manager. I don't know what he's referring to here, because clearly the postmasters had been trained to balance their accounts on Horizon, and I'm not sure what the change is here. I've got no recollection of that.
He says it may be that our branch is unique in this matter and that the policy has been successfully rolled out to all our colleagues. It seems more likely from experience that this policy is as yet far from universal in its application and is hampered by poor communication and lack of training. From our correspondence, I had assumed that I was the only one at fault and out of step. I now wonder how many others are in the same position as my branch colleagues and me. Do you remember that correspondence at all?
No.
No. Do you know why he might have felt that he was the only one at fault? That's certainly a phrase similar to one we've heard before in this inquiry.
Well, I've heard it said that a lot of postmasters, when they reported problems with the Horizon system to our helpline, they were told, well, you're the only person that's got a problem with it. So what he's saying there is consistent with what many other people have said.
Yes, and did that stick in your memory at all?
It doesn't stick in my memory, no. Not this specific case or any others similar to that.
Do you agree that in 2004 you had received complaints from relatively early on in the life of Horizon about a lack of training?
It was either sporadic complaints that someone felt that they needed more training to cope with the system, or because I'd identified a problem that was to do with capability, where I'd identified the need for more support.
When, and we'll come to the policies in due course, but when it came to formulating various policies, did you have in your mind at all difficulties that sub-postmasters may have with training?
Well, the company had a policy that was already in place to deal with what were capability issues with postmasters, and there was a process that sat alongside that. So they could be offered either upon their request or upon the request of others that work for POL, additional training and support, and that would be delivered by the training team perhaps or their area manager.
But did any lack of training or issues with training feature in any way in your thinking when you were drafting various policies?
What, years later?
Yes.
No, I don't think it did. I think that the people that had a close relationship with postmasters, like area managers, field advisors, contracts teams, were quite adept at identifying where there were capability issues and providing additional support. So that was just something that happened really across a whole range of issues in a postmaster's life cycle. It wasn't necessarily connected to their accounting. It could be any aspect of the way they operated the business.
So we have this letter from 2004. Are you aware of it being followed up and those people being trained?
I've got no recollection of that, no.
Can we please look up poll 00114930, please? Now moving forward to 2009, and can we go over to the second page? It's a chain of emails in 2009. Can we look at the bottom half of that page, please? I'm going to start here with an email from Jessica Madron. Do you remember who she was? She was in legal.
She was a principal lawyer in Post Office Legal Services.
Can you assist us with the recipients of this email? How senior they were, what kind of roles they held?
Well, Tracy Marshall was my line manager at the time. I think the people that were CC'd in tended to be more junior in the hierarchy of the organisation.
Thank you. I'll briefly read some of this email. Do you recall having received this?
Well, only this week. You know, I don't have any recollection back to 2009 of this case. No.
So there is a letter. It's entitled "Letter from Burr," that's now the Department for Business, re-challenge to Horizon Integrity. And it says there, a reporter has written to her MP referring to conversations she has had with a sub-postmaster to the effect that the Horizon system is faulty and shows deficits where there are none, and that POL, the Post Office, just reclaims these deficits from sub-postmasters. There's also a reference to a website for sub-postmasters who have been victims of the Post Office's approach. Why would you be contacted in this regard?
Well, because my job title included the word agent or postmaster, I would often be sent or copied in on emails that related to agents, postmasters.
When you say because your job title included that, what do you mean by that?
Well, if something was not to do with the Crown Post Office and it was to do with a postmaster, I would often find myself being copied in on something.
Because you were seen
either
as
for information or because I was being asked to say or do something specifically in response to the email.
So in this particular email, you're in the to list rather than the CC list.
That's correct, yeah.
So does that signify to you that somebody thought that you were the appropriate person alongside Tracy Marshall to address this issue?
Correct, yeah.
Can we look at the first page? And I'm going to take you through an email, the response from yourself. Thank you. So, dear Jessica, you say, I have some experience of this type of complaint from my time as a contracts manager. So just pausing there, we spoke about half an hour ago or so about whether you had received complaints, and you couldn't recall any during your conversation in 2018. You then recalled one having seen the documents in the bundle. This certainly suggests that you did have more than just one complaint from a sub-postmaster.
From 2002 to 2004.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the context of my question earlier as well, about the early days of Horizon. And I think you could only recall one having seen documents, but it's clear here that in 2009 you could recall that you had received a fair few more.
I can't say how many, but more than one.
You go on there to say, from time to time, either existing agents or those suspended/terminated due to accounting irregularities/unpaid debts will say that it is the Horizon system that has caused a loss. On each occasion, I had asked the sub-postmaster to substantiate the allegation. They had been unable to provide any evidence to support it. Now, from time to time suggests certainly more than one, probably a fair few, given that it's from time to time.
Over a 3-year period, yeah.
I'm unable to provide any evidence. How was it that a sub-postmaster would be able to provide evidence that the Horizon system has caused a loss?
Well, the postmaster's ability to interrogate the system was limited. So, for example, they could look at event logs to see who'd had access to the system. They could look at transaction logs to see the detail of the transactions processed through the system. And it would be possible to perform some type of reconciliation between physical documents and what the system was producing. But I think that their ability to interrogate the system was limited.
Looking back at this now, do you think that that was too high a hurdle for a sub-postmaster to have to overcome to substantiate that there had been they had to provide evidence?
I think looking back on it now, I don't think many postmasters would have the capability or the resources or the time to perform a long audit of their own work in the system in order to detect why discrepancies had happened.
And even if they could compare certain physical documents with what is on screen, if a bug, error, or defect affected the data that was on the screen, do you think that they could actually identify that bug, error, or defect?
No, absolutely not. And nor would they be able to know that it was possible to access the system at the back end without their knowledge.
And that, I think you've said in your statement, was something that you only found out relatively late in the day.
I'd heard of this around the time that the group litigation order was imminent.
You say, in many respects, Horizon is a sophisticated calculator and operates on the principle of GI/GO, garbage in, garbage out. It's no more likely that with 100% accurate input, Horizon produces inaccurate outputs than a calculator would, which is extremely unlikely. I said we'll come back to this description of it being a calculator. I mean, looking back, that can't be right, can it?
I think that is an oversimplification of what Horizon is. And I did go on to say that you couldn't say absolutely that the system was flawless.
You say in some respects, though, there are items of data transferred between other terminals in store and from Horizon to head office, it's always possible that in these data streams, electronic data could go astray, either because of human error or an IT failure, and that could cause transaction corrections to be produced either in favour or against the agent.
Correct.
You then say, it's not possible to say absolutely that the system could not cause a loss or gain, and some time back when Horizon was introduced, the Post Office wrote off a considerable number of losses that appeared in agents' accounts on migration from manual accounts. After some investigation, it was not possible to show where the losses had occurred. So quite frankly, you made very clear that there were cases where the Post Office couldn't show where the losses had occurred.
Yeah, I think there was an issue around the physical migration from manual accounts to Horizon, where a poll employee attended the postmaster's premises, did a physical count of the cash and stock to make sure that the starting point on Horizon was accurate. And I think quite a lot of discrepancies were uncovered at that point, shortages or surpluses.
So this would have been during the rollout of Horizon?
It was, yeah. I've had direct experience of visiting one branch where I think there was a discrepancy, not huge, that had just happened as part of the weekly balance. And anecdotally, I think a number of other people had found that to be the case.
And you say Post Office's approach is consistent in that when a sub-postmaster challenges a transaction correction, they have an opportunity to produce evidence to support their claim, and that is considered by the contracts team, and consideration can be given to writing off all or part of the loss. It is a fact that these days far fewer losses are written off, as some years back there was a culture of weak management where some losses were inappropriate for write-off, were written off. Perhaps the proliferation of these complaints is the outcome of that, or the Post Office becoming more hawkish in the way it manages debt/integrity issues. I'd like to look at the culture of the Post Office. Can you assist us with that, what seems to be described as some sort of culture shift?
I think I'm referring back to a period of time where every postmaster would have a direct relationship with an area manager, and all the branches were account managed. And I think for many postmasters then, the relationship was a lot closer, and they were receiving a lot more direct face-to-face support. And when I started off as an area manager in the 90s, I think you often used to see or hear about cases where a postmaster had requested a shortage to be written off. And I think there was probably more leniency in that period of time. And I think the change happened because of business efficiency. Far fewer postmasters had that direct face-to-face relationship with postmasters, and they were more reliant on the helpline.
And can you assist us with time periods?
Yeah, well, the time when I think all postmasters had that direct account-managed relationship was when I started as an area manager, which was probably in the early 90s. And then there were subsequent reorganisations of the business that meant that there were fewer people out in the field supporting postmasters, and that just process seemed to continue for a long time in various business rationalisations. And as I said, they became more reliant on their relationship with the helpline, and they would see poll people in the field on far fewer occasions, and normally when there was a problem.
You describe it here as a culture of weak management. That's a term that you used in 2009. Did the Post Office, as at 2009, see the former approach as a culture of weak management?
I'm not sure that the Post Office did. That was just my opinion of how things were at the time. There were just decisions made in terms of writing things off that perhaps the losses weren't properly evidenced why that had happened. It was probably a more sympathetic culture.
And why in 2009 would you have considered a sympathetic culture to be a culture of weak management?
Because there were approaches, processes, policies to follow, and it may have been that those were bent out of shape a little bit in the terms of providing outcomes for postmasters with the best intentions to help them.
You described how previously the management was more regional or more local,
Yeah.
and that they would have more of a relationship with the sub-postmasters, and that became more central.
Yes.
What I'd like to understand is how it is that a change from somebody who knows the sub-postmaster to somebody who doesn't know a sub-postmaster is interpreted as the former being effectively weak and the latter being strong.
I think there were examples of what I've described there as weak behaviours, i.e. not sticking to agreed policies and processes. Well, I think when it moved to a more central relationship, the operators of helplines stuck rigidly to policies and processes.
And you say they stuck rigidly. Was that at the request of those who were in charge of the policies and procedures?
I think it was just an outcome of an organisational change where people who were like tier 1 helpline operators had less. They didn't have management discretion. They were helpline operators trying to do their best, sticking to scripts and processes. Whereas area managers back in the 90s, I think, had more leeway and management discretion, control of their own budgets to do certain things.
Looking at this now, knowing what you know, do you still see the earlier approach to be a culture of weak management?
But if you applied that approach and cut and paste it onto the Horizon era, no, because there should be more analysis of why shortages have happened than there was from 2001, I think, when Horizon was introduced. Before, postmasters were asked to repay shortages. And I'll go further than that and say that there should have been a process where if a discrepancy had arisen either at audit or in some other way, the possibility that that discrepancy had been generated by the system and therefore was a phantom discrepancy should have been ruled out prior to the discrepancy being recovered.
And I'll just read one more sentence. It says, "I think our line must be that the Post Office is always prepared to consider representations that are based on proper documentary evidence and not simply an obtuse, the system did it." I think following the evidence that you've just given, your reflection on that is that that was actually too high a hurdle for sub-postmasters to overcome.
I agree.
Do you know if you were ultimately involved in the response to this complaint from the journalist and the Member of Parliament?
I was never involved in drafting responses to any of those.
Do you recall any follow-up after your email?
No.
So this is 2009. We've looked at your comments in 2018 to the lawyer in relation to the group litigation. They're very similar in response to the issues with Horizon, lack of knowledge of issues with Horizon. Was there nothing in that 10-year period, or almost 10-year period, 2009 to 2018, that made you rethink your position?
I think in the background you had the Justice for Sub-Postmasters campaign. I wasn't directly involved in answering anything that came from that campaign, and I tend to think that the people around me in the company were quite sceptical and dismissive about the things that were being said, and I can't recall any trend of anything happening really that would cause me to think that there were significant problems in the system.
I mean, we know that the Computer Weekly article, for example, was published on the 11th of May 2009, so it's very soon after that email exchange. Did that not make you rethink the experiences, for example, when you had been contract manager, had received those complaints about training?
No, because I didn't read it or have any knowledge of it. The only thing that made me rethink about how cases were managed is the information that emerged from the group litigation onwards. And I would think back and try and think of specific examples of what I would have done differently, or had I seen any evidence that the Horizon system was flawed. And at all of those points, I wasn't able to identify anything that I could have, specific examples historically.
I mean, you had that email exchange in 2009, very shortly before Computer Weekly, about a letter from a Member of Parliament having been informed by a reporter. You then have the Computer Weekly article. Is that not something that you saw at the time as brought to your attention, that people talked about?
No. The first time I heard of the Computer Weekly argument was reading Nick Wallace's account of developments online in the last 2 to 3 years.
Did you notice any change in activity within the post office, within the various hierarchies, with those who you communicated with, in response to trying to get to the bottom of any problems that were identified?
Well, I know that there was concern within the company about the number of postmasters that were being suspended as a result of bad audits, and there were changes put in place to make sure that these suspensions were authorised at quite a high level in the company. But that didn't tell me that there were inherent problems with the Horizon system. It just told me that there was a general concern about the number of suspensions that were happening, because we were finding it problematic to keep services going in some communities, and that was always a strong imperative for the company.
Who in particular do you recall being concerned about the number of suspensions?
Well, at the time, I was working in the agency development team. I'm trying to approximate the years. I think it was around 2017, 18, 2008, 2009, and Kevin Gilliland was the head of that team, and I know that he had concerns about some specific cases where a postmaster had been suspended, and I recall that there was a change to the approach regarding either prosecutions or suspensions around that time, based on a meeting that he'd had with legal services and Paul Venels, who was network director at the time. And then I think there was some authorisation process at a reasonably high level before a suspension could happen. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Was there a concern that you noticed within the post office about shining a light on those issues in that 2009 period?
No.
I want to return to your interview with Womble Bond Dickinson. So that's poll 0000 and then 4 6s. And it's page 46 that I'd like to look at. It's the bottom half of page 46. It seems there that you're going through with the solicitor a document, maybe a pleading or a request of some sort from the claimants. Do you recall that?
Which paragraph?
So if we look at, say, VB, she says 64.9. And I'll read that to you. She says 64.9, to communicate or alternatively not to conceal the extent to which other sub-postmasters were experiencing issues relating to Horizon and the generation of discrepancies and alleged shortfalls. So what they want to have here, I think, is information sharing about Postmaster A has got a problem, and that should be told to Postmaster B or possibly to all the other postmasters. So there seems to be a request to that the post office should be communicating with postmasters about problems with other postmasters.
A request from whom?
Well, exactly. That was my question.
Yeah.
Do you recall that it seems to be some sort of document of requests, perhaps from the claimants in the group litigation?
No.
Your answer to that proposal was as follows. You said, well, first of all, there's the issue of confidentiality and data protection concerning other people. Secondly, commercially, it would make no sense to do that because that information could then be used by others as a smokescreen to defraud the company. The other point is, where we've seen examples of good practice or bad practice, then we would publicise and do publicise that because we do not want agents to suffer financial harm. So to suggest that could be an obligation on us. I think commercially it makes no sense at all. So you raise there issues of confidentiality, data protection. You say it would be commercially bad. You say it could encourage fraud. There seems to be a quick list of reasons not to provide information to sub-postmasters about bugs, errors or defects within the system. How is it that you gave that answer?
I think it just seems to make sense, really.
Can you see the problems with that
At
answer?
the time, in the context of
The lack of information sharing with sub-postmasters about other sub-postmasters having discrepancies and alleged shortfalls.
I think that you wouldn't talk to one postmaster about experiences other postmasters had had. That doesn't seem to make any sense for the business to do that.
Why wouldn't it make sense for the business?
But it may not be helpful in terms of dealing with the complaint that a postmaster had put to us.
Because it wouldn't help the post office.
It wouldn't get to the bottom of the dispute, would it? If a postmaster A says that they had a problem with their accounts, it wouldn't be helpful to them or us to publicise other postmasters that had also had problems with their accounts. They've still got a discrepancy in their accounts, haven't they?
Was that your view, the view of your department, the view of the company as a whole?
It was just a response that was put to me at that particular point in time by Victoria, really, and it was just a practical objection to sharing information regarding other postmasters, I think.
Do you now recognise the problems with that?
Like in the last 2 or 3 years, I've read that a lot of people have said that they were told that they were the only one experiencing problems with their Horizon system, and clearly they weren't. So yeah, it's hard to reconcile what I now know with what I said back then.
The company, of course, was prosecuting people.
Yeah.
And people were losing their livelihoods. You were involved in, for example, the debt policies, debt recovery policies.
Yeah.
People were affected who were saying that they had discrepancies or alleged shortfalls caused by bugs, errors or defects.
Yes.
I mean, revisiting that position from 2018, not so long ago, do you see the problem with that approach?
I think looking at it now, I think it was incumbent on the company to be completely open and honest about problems with the system at the point that they were aware of those problems.
And where was that mindset of confidentiality, data protection, commercial implications? Where was that coming from?
But that was just my own opinion at that particular point in time in reaction to a question that had been put to me by Victoria, really.
Having received, for example, from time to time during your time as a contract manager, complaints from sub-postmasters, having been involved in that 2009 correspondence about from the journalist, the complaint to the Member of Parliament, why do you think it is that you didn't recognise the importance of information sharing and put up quite quickly those barriers?
I think it's because over a long period of time, I would deal with, there was something like 13,000, 14,000 postmasters. And as a contracts manager, you would deal with a certain number of those, maybe 1,000, in my part of the southeast. And you would always look at the scale of complaints compared to the total network size, and it didn't appear to be huge. It was difficult for me, just looking after 1,000 agents, to see that perhaps the problem was much bigger than I thought it was.
So you didn't have visibility of the figures around the country?
No, there was no sort of data sharing of what was going on around the country. I think at one point it became apparent that the number of suspensions and terminations had sort of increased compared to a time when there were manual accounts, pre-Horizon. And the narrative in the company was that was because the Horizon system provided us more insight into what was going on in branch, and therefore audit activity could be targeted with more intelligence, and therefore you would expect the post office to uncover more discrepancies.
And the identification of the issue with a large number of suspensions, etc., is that the time period that you previously told us about, and the discussion? I think you mentioned a number of names that were involved in that, or is this a different period?
It was during the period of time when I was working for Craig Tuthill, and John Breeden was in charge, and Lynn Norbury in charge of the contracts advisors, and there was some sharing of information on a sort of bi-monthly basis about the number of suspensions. So that was maybe the period of time, probably 14, 15, 16, sometime around then. And yeah, there was concern in the company about the number of suspensions, and that was roughly around the same time where there had been a sort of policy change, a top-down policy change regarding who could authorise suspensions on the basis of a bad audit or for any other reason.
And where did you see that drive coming from?
At the top.
What do you mean by top?
Well,
Sorry.
the exco level.
The executive.
Yeah.
The views that we've seen in those emails about Horizon acting like a calculator, etc. Is it fair to say that you held those views when you drafted the various policies that we're going to see, in particular debt recovery policy?
Yeah, that's fair. You know, my view about the system didn't change until the emergence of, you know, a large amount of information from the group litigation regarding the flaws in the software and the bugs.
And when you were drafting the policies, we'll look now at the debt policy, debt recovery policy.
Yeah.
The ability or the potential for there to be bugs, errors, or defects in the system, was that ever part of the conversation?
No. Be very clear that the debt recovery policy was quite simple. You know, debts are there to be recovered by the company. And it was quite unusual for me to be asked to get involved in something like that was managed elsewhere in finance and between the contracts team. And I think that the reason I was asked to do it was more to do with the process. And there was it was a bit clunky. There were problems between the contracts team and finance. It wasn't working well. It wasn't anything to do with the real policy of recovering debt. It was just process mapping, really.
Can you summarise for us the problem?
I don't recall what the specific disjoins in the process or what the tensions were between finance and the contracts team. I wasn't told. It was Craig Tuthill, I think, that instructed me to refresh the process. It wasn't policy, it was process mapping. And I had numerous conversations with people in that part of the world just to agree a better process, a more efficient process.
I'm going to bring that document onto the screen. It's
Yeah.
poll 00113670. This is the 2013 version of the policy.
Yeah.
It's called Operators in Service Debt. And we see at the bottom of this page, you are listed there as assurance. If we could scroll down, sorry. There, that's your name there. Why does your name appear there?
Because I'm the owner of policy, and therefore it didn't get implemented unless I was content with it.
I think you said in your witness statement that you drafted this policy or were responsible for drafting it. Did you actually input some of the text? Or?
I think a lot of the screwdriver work was probably done by one of my team, and therefore there were just iterations between me and Ravi in terms of developing the approach and the drafting work. I think he did a lot of the process mapping, but that's about the extent that my memory will allow.
Would you have been the most senior member of the post office to have reviewed this before it was finalised?
No, there were people in that circulate. If you scroll up, there were people in that circulation list that.
They're listed as stakeholders. Would they have reviewed it before it was finalised?
Yeah, they would have been asked to comment on the process mapping.
Thank you. If we look at page 3, it sets out the purpose of the policy.
Yeah.
It says the purpose of this policy is to clearly set out the processes Post Office Limited will follow to recover debt incurred in service by operators of all post office branches. And if we scroll down to in the glossary, it defines operator there, a little bit lower down on the page. An operator is any individual, company or partnership, including sub-postmasters and franchisees, responsible for the operation of any post office branch. So this policy, to summarise, it sets out the processes for the post office to follow to recover debt incurred by, amongst other people.
Operator at that time was just used as an umbrella term for agents. Now it's postmasters on different contract types.
Thank you. Could we go over the page 4, please? 3.2 says, this policy is designed to provide clear and consistent guidelines and processes for the Post Office to recover transactional and non-transactional debt incurred whilst in service by operators of all Post Office branches, whether they're still in service or have subsequently resigned. And then we have background. It's the background section that I'm particularly interested in. Is it possible to, if we could keep this on screen, and I'm just going to bring up alongside it a later version of the same policy. So if we could keep that perhaps on the left-hand side, if that's possible. And if we could bring up POL 000888312. This is a 2017 version. Is that the same policy, but just a later version?
I'm just looking.
The earlier version is called Operators in Service Debt, and this one's called Postmasters in Service Debt.
Yeah, I think it's a later iteration.
Thank you. And that also has your authorisation in 2017. So it looks as though in 2013 you authorised a policy. You subsequently authorised updates, and you authorised this one in 2017.
Yeah.
If we could go to page 3 on the right-hand side, we should be able to see the bottom half of page 3. If we could zoom in the same way as we have on the left-hand side. Thank you very much. It's the contractual position. If you could scroll down slightly. Thank you. It seems that they're largely the same, these two. On the left-hand side, we have, from a purely contractual perspective, the operator of a post office branch is responsible for, and then it has 3 points. I'm going to come to each of those. I think the only real difference between 4.1 and 3.1 is the reference to without delay on the right-hand side, making good without delay. So on the left-hand side, we have the word making good in the bullet points. In the right-hand side, we don't have them in the bullet points, but they are in 3.1. But there is a difference, and it seems to be in the time period in which but they had to be made good. Do you see that difference?
Yeah, in the first document it says without delay. In the second document, it doesn't say that.
I think it's the later document that says without delay. The
Oh, I
earlier
see.
one doesn't. Do you recall a change in the time period, for example, that things needed to be made good, or?
No, because that would have been managed between finance and the contracts team in terms of the amount of time that was allowed to make good losses.
Both of those say, from a purely contractual perspective, can you assist us? Were all sub-postmasters on the same contract? Were there different contracts?
No, you had what I refer to as the traditional contract. So that would be sub-postmaster, modified sub-postmaster, community sub-postmaster. Then you had the contracts that emerged as part of the network transformation program, and they were referred to as operators. So that was an entirely different type of contract. There were lots of variants of those contract types.
And were these 3 bullet points intended to capture all of those different versions of the contract?
Yeah, the latter policy, I think the original policy wasn't developed in the life cycle of network transformation. So the latter policy would have been designed to take into account the network transformation contracts.
So am I right to understand that some sub-postmasters would have signed a contract pre-network transformation and be operating under whatever contract it is they signed there?
Correct.
Others post, but both would be held to this policy?
Yeah, the policy spanned all postmasters, yeah.
Can you assist us with why the reference there is from a purely contractual perspective, the operator is responsible for? What do you think is meant there by purely contractual perspective? It seems to imply that there's, for example, some discretion over and above what the contract says.
No, I think I was just making it clear that it was a contractual obligation, not that I thought there was something happening beyond the contract.
You've said in your statement, and I think you've really repeated it today, that sub-postmasters could write to their manager, contracts advisor, or even to the post office. Might that be why there's a reference there to the contractual perspective? Because the reality was that you could go outside of your contract and make an approach to somebody.
No, I just don't think that was in my mind at all at that point. As I said, the whole issue of dialing down losses or writing them off, that was a long time ago, in any volume. I didn't see in 2017, 18 that happening, but I wouldn't, because I wasn't managing the contracts advisors or area managers. It was something, if it was happening, it was discreet to me.
To assist us with time periods, do you mean in the early days of legacy Horizon, so 2000, 2001, 2002, etc., there was still that?
No, I mean in the era of manual accounts, where postmasters were account managed, had a closer relationship with area managers in the field.
And you don't believe that happened during the lifetime of Horizon?
If it did, I wouldn't have any knowledge of it, because I was in a more senior role, and I wasn't managing postmasters directly, except for the time when I was a contracts advisor, manager in 2002 to 2004. And even at that point, my recollection is it was extremely rare to receive these type of requests from postmasters.
Looking at those bullet points, the first one is making good any loss of post office cash and stock without delay, or in fact, so the without delay there appears on the left-hand side. There's no real difference there. But the first one is any loss of post office cash and stock. The second is any losses incurred while operating under the respective contractual arrangements that come to light following termination of the agreement. And the third is all losses incurred through their own negligence, carelessness, or error, and also for losses caused by their post office assistants. So the first bullet point we have there is any loss. So the postmaster is responsible for any loss. And the third one is all losses save for example, it seems if it wasn't caused by their own negligence, carelessness or error. Can you explain to us why the first of those reads as though any losses must be paid back, but the third reads as though there might be some reasons to excuse a sub-postmaster?
I think that there was a difference between the network transformation contracts and the traditional contracts in terms of what the postmaster's obligations were. And I think there was probably in the network transformation contracts, I think it was the obligations were probably heavier from memory. I can't remember specifically how, than what was placed upon the postmasters who had traditional contracts. I think there was some tightening of the drafting.
So in fact, it may have been that the first bullet point was intended to capture those who had signed the post-network transformation contract, and the third bullet point was intended to capture those who had signed the original sub-postmaster's contract.
It's quite possible, but I can't remember specifically what my thinking was at the time.
Can you see there potential cause for confusion amongst those who are operating this policy as to whether they were to take action in respect of all losses or just those that weren't caused by their own negligence, that were caused by their own negligence, carelessness or error?
Well, I think typically the people managing the whole issue of recovery of losses was either finance or the contracts advisors, and that was their sort of bread and butter business really. Part of it was recovering debts, and they would always be mindful of what type of contract the postmaster was on when doing that, or should have been.
Looking at this document, though, the policy document about recovery of debt, can you see that there could be cause for confusion in respect of the circumstances in which you can, in fact, recover debt from sub-postmasters?
If you relied purely on the policy document and weren't cognizant of which type of contract the postmaster was on and the circumstances in which the debt had arisen, yeah, there would be.
Separately, was there any thinking at this time, I think you've already given this answer, but to bugs, errors and defects and how that might fit into this situation?
No.
I'll just before the break, I'll just take you to the community sub-postmaster contract. That's poll 00000246. And it's page 71. So this, I mean, we have various different iterations of this policy. Perhaps if we go over, sorry, yes, that's fine. On page 71, you have there, this is under section 8, responsibility for post offices, stock and cash. And in paragraph 12, we have a heading, losses. Mm-hmm. And it says there, the sub-postmaster is responsible for all losses caused through his own negligence, carelessness or error, and also for losses of all kinds caused by his assistants. Deficiencies due to such losses must be made good without delay. So that does that assist you, that looks very much like that third bullet point, but not at all like the first bullet point?
Yeah, I think looking at that, that policy spans the sort of more modern network transformation contracts and the traditional contracts.
Well, it doesn't span both, does it? This is pre-network transformation.
It is, yeah.
And it has there a provision that refers to negligence, carelessness or error.
It does, yeah.
And is quite differently worded to that first bullet point in the policy.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. I think in the network transformation contracts, I think the obligations were more onerous upon the operator than they were in the traditional contracts, and therefore the first and third bullet points in the policy document attempts to deal with that.
Mr. Justice Fraser, in the Bates litigation, in one of the judgments, he refers to a case where a sub-postmistress received a letter saying that they were contractually obliged to make good any losses occurred during their term in office. And he remarked that that overstated the position because, as you can see in 12, it's not in fact any losses. Do you think that some of those problems come down to the policy that we've just looked at and the ambiguity between those 3 bullet points?
Yeah, it's possible if someone looked back at the policy document and wasn't mindful of which contract the postmaster was on when they sent a letter, then there is scope for confusion. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you. Sir, that might be an appropriate time to take our mid-morning break.
Yeah, sure.
If we could come back at 35 minutes past.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much. Sir, Mr. Inwood, I'm going to move on to a different topic, and that's the resolution of disputes. You explain in your statement that as contracts manager and as appeals manager, you were involved in disputes regarding alleged shortfalls and the procedures that they involved.
Correct.
Can you assist us? How would evidence be gathered in respect of that?
So, for example, if an audit had occurred and there was a discrepancy, significant discrepancy in the accounts, then the auditors would complete a report about what they had found, and then after the precautionary suspension of the postmaster, if that was necessary, that would be sent to me, and therefore I would evaluate that report to see if there had been a potential breach, material breach of contract, and then a charge letter would be sent to the postmaster setting out the charge, which could be something like false accounting or misuse of post office funds, and then they would have the option of making a written representation or have a personal hearing, often attended with a member of the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters, and they would have the opportunity to present any exculpatory evidence for those charges. And then, based on that and any further investigation that was necessary because of the outcome of that hearing, then I and other contracts managers would draw up a balance sheet of the evidence and determine whether there had been a material breach of contract based on the balance of probability. And once that decision had been made, and then if there had been, then an evaluation was made as to what be the most appropriate outcome for Pole and the postmaster.
Can you assist us with whether there was some sort of disclosure process to sub-postmasters during that procedure?
The postmaster should be provided with a copy of the evidence that the contracts manager had received from the auditors or the security team. The security team were not always involved. It would depend on the circumstances. So they should receive a copy of the inculpatory evidence.
We've heard quite a lot about something called ARQ data or the audit data obtainable from Fujitsu itself. Is that something that you recall being provided to sub-postmasters?
I'm not familiar with that during the period of time I was a contracts manager or after that.
Thank you. And what kind of period of time are we talking about when you would sit on those hearings?
As a contracts manager, it was 2002 through to the end of, I think, 2004. There was a period of time when I was an appeals manager, but it's difficult for me to approximate the years during which that was the case.
But it would have been after your time?
It would have been after 2005, because to be an appeals manager, you had to be at a certain level in the company, senior manager level in the company.
So if we'll start with the first level,
Yeah.
contract manager. You've said that a representative of the National Federation for Sub-Postmasters could attend, or I think you also said in your statement that a friend could attend.
Or a friend, yeah.
I just want to take you back to the Sub-Postmaster contract. So that is POL 00000246. And it's page 93. Actually, if we could look at 92 and 93. Page 92, section 14 seems to govern the appeals procedure. So I think that's the second stage, isn't it?
Yeah.
If we look at page 93, I don't think this is the first stage, is it? This is a different type of investigation for a criminal offence, or do you understand this to have governed that first stage?
No, I agree with what you just said,
Yes.
yeah.
I just want to use an analogy, though. If we turn to page 95, there is a reference to friends at investigation interviews. And then if we turn to page 96, at the top there, paragraph 19, it says this in relation to those criminal investigations. It says, a friend may only attend and listen to questions and answers. He must not interrupt in any way, either by word or signal. If he does interrupt, he'll be required to leave at once, and the interview will proceed without him. Whatever is said at the interviews is to be treated as in strictest confidence. The friend may take notes of the interview, but he must keep the notes in the strictest confidence. The only communication the friend is entitled to make on behalf of the person who has been questioned will be in the form of a written, in strictest confidence statement, which may be submitted by the latter in support of any official appeal which the person questioned may desire to make in connection with the methods followed at the inquiry. No other communication about the interview is allowed unless made by permission of the Post Office, as it might constitute a breach of the Official Secrets Acts. The questioned officer may, however, if he so desires, communicate the friend's statement to the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters in strictest confidence. As I say, this doesn't apply to those hearings, but was a similar regime in place for those hearings in respect of what the friend or assistant could or could not do?
I think that the custom and practice when I was a contracts manager was that a friend who may also be an officer of the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters could attend what they referred to as the reasons to urge hearing. And it was the case that the NFSP officer would speak on behalf of the postmaster. And I think that was because a lot of postmasters found that to be quite a difficult meeting and were not able to properly articulate their defence or mitigation to the charges. And I think that was custom and practice through the period of time I was a contracts manager.
If you weren't an officer of the National Federation for Sub-Postmasters,
Yeah.
were you allowed to speak?
I believe it was custom and practice to make some representation.
So if you were attending as a friend, for example,
Yeah.
were you allowed to say something?
Yeah, I don't think there was any differentiation at the time between what type of friend you were or whether you was an NFSP officer. It just happened to be the case that most people were represented by officers of the NFSP because they had some considerable experience and training in dealing with these issues.
Were lawyers allowed to attend?
No,
Do you know the reason for that at all?
because, well, I guess if a friend was also a lawyer, that wouldn't preclude them from attending. But if they were there in a capacity as a lawyer and acting on behalf of their client, that would not be allowed because it was a private matter between the company and the postmaster.
Were you assisted at that stage one decision by lawyers within the post office?
No, not as a contracts manager, no. If there was any criminal investigation into the case, that was dealt with entirely separately in a silo from any action that the contracts manager would take in the civil case.
Thank you. Can we look at poll 000888982, please? If we look over the page, this is a document that was drafted by yourself. And if we turn, your name is at the bottom of that second page. But then if we turn back to the first page, there's handwritten, in confidence and draft. Am I right to say you drafted this, or this is a draft that you drafted?
I drafted this policy, yeah.
Yes. I'm not sure if we have the final version of this, and you can tell me if you recall that anything was significantly or substantively different from the version that we're looking at. Background, it says, from time to time, contracts advisors and appeals managers will be required to give consideration to what would be an appropriate outcome where an agent is found to be culpable of a serious breach of contract. Typically, but not exclusively, these breaches will be in the form of false accounting and or misuse of post office funds. What kind of period was this in operation, do you recall?
I think the policy was drafted sometime around 2014 onwards.
Was there a policy before that?
There was an approach, yeah. I think there were historic policies that existed prior to that, and obviously.
To what extent did you consider yourself to be qualified to be drafting this policy?
Because it was a policy that supported people within Pole dealing with material breaches of contract, or alleged material breaches of contract, and it was done with iterations between myself and legal services. And
who in legal services do you recall liaising?
I think the principal person would have been Jessica Madron.
We see there under guidance notes, it says, in cases where guilt has been proven on the basis of balance of all probabilities. Do you recall, was that the test that you applied, guilt on the basis of balance of all probabilities?
Yes, whether the charges were proven on the test of balance of all probabilities as opposed to beyond any reasonable doubt. The threshold was lower in a civil case.
Do you recognise any difficulty looking at that now, that test? So, first of all, guilt. This isn't a criminal matter.
No, it was loose terminology. I think it was better to say culpability for the charges, yeah.
And balance of all probabilities, it sounds a bit like a conflation between balance of probabilities, which is a civil test, and beyond reasonable doubt, or...
That was not what I had in mind when I drafted it. It was just perhaps loose terminology.
And do you think that was applied by... That was the test that was applied by people who were using this policy?
If they followed the policy, yeah.
When these kinds of policies were being drafted, was there any consideration of what impact bugs, errors or defects in Horizon may have?
No. The reason that the instructions were given to me to develop this policy is because the company was concerned that there weren't a broad enough array of options to apply where it had been proven that there had been a material breach of contract. And that ties in with the belief that there were, perhaps too many suspensions and, outcomes were problematic for the company in terms of maintaining continuity of service. So the policy prescribed additional outcomes that could have been applied by contracts advisors, for example, a suspended termination where it was believed that termination was not appropriate in the circumstances. So it was just driven by providing a broader array of options for contracts advisors.
So if we scroll down, we can see there are aggravating factors and mitigating factors that might assist in making a decision as to how to deal with a contract breach. And as you say, this policy was implemented because there was a concern that too many people were having their contracts terminated or suspended.
No. I think it was the main driver was that the contract advisors needed to have a broader array of options in terms of the outcome of the case. That was the main driver for the policy.
Because prior to that, the only option would be to suspend or terminate.
Yeah, it would be binary.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, suspension, a precautionary suspension would be a precursor to this process. And then once this process had started, then the options were that either the postmaster would be reinstated or that the contract would be summarily terminated.
And they needed aggravating, mitigating factors, more options. Was that not driven by the fact that they were experiencing a high level of terminations?
I think there was a background concern in the company that was that there were too many suspensions, too many cases where we were losing post office services in some communities and not being able to maintain those after the fact of termination.
And you say this was 2013, did you say?
I think it was around 2014 perhaps.
So a fair amount of time after, for example, that Computer Weekly article that we've talked about, or the correspondence from the journalist to the Member of Parliament about complaints about...
Yeah, I don't believe there was a nexus between the two.
No, and do you think there should have been a nexus between the two, in that bugs, errors or defects in Horizon might have been something to consider during...
Yeah, with hindsight, I think that as part of the whole process around suspension, dealing with alleged material breaches of contract, as I said earlier, I think there should have been a process in place where the possibility of a discrepancy being caused by software errors, bugs, should have been ruled out as a possible cause prior to contractual action being taken. I can see why it would be necessary to issue a precautionary suspension upon the advent of a significant discrepancy in a postmaster's accounts. But in that period of suspension, I think there should have been more diligence by the company in flushing out any possible IT causes.
Moving to appeals, you said that you were an appeals manager.
That was, yeah.
In your statement, you referred to conducting your own investigation as part of that process. What exactly did that involve?
Well, the purpose of the appeal was to rehear the case. So looking at any inculpatory and exculpatory evidence and then examining both and, if necessary, conducting a further investigation into the facts internally prior to reaching a conclusion.
In terms of, say, audit data, do you think you were capable of properly understanding audit data and obtaining the right information from, for example, Fujitsu, if required?
I think the audit report would be taken at face value by any appeals manager.
And was that because the appeals manager didn't have the right skill set to analyse those kinds of things?
I don't think they would have been able to analyse the data, but at that point in time, it wouldn't have entered my mind or any appeals manager, I don't believe, to test whether the discrepancy had been caused by failures in the system.
If a sub-postmaster had said that losses were arising because of a software error, what would you be able to do as part of your investigation to get to the bottom of that?
Well, that would be raised internally, and I'd have to investigate how to determine whether that was the case or not. I can't remember a case when I was an appeals manager where that was raised with me internally, but the number of appeals you would hear were very, very small. You know, if you heard one a year, that would be normal. There was quite a large panel of appeals managers. So it was difficult to get a sort of holistic view about whether that was being raised a lot at the appeal stage.
You've said that at the first stage you weren't assisted by lawyers. At the appeal stage, was there legal involvement at all?
No.
And if I could go back to the contract, so that's POL 00000246. It's page 92, where it addresses the appeals procedure. And if we could look at the bottom of page 92, please. There's a reference there to appeals, and then it says approaches to persons outside the post office, paragraph 6. It says, until the sub-postmaster has exercised his final right of appeal, he should not ask persons outside the post office to take up the case on his behalf, although this does not prevent a sub-postmaster from obtaining such advice and support from the NFSP or any other outside person as may help him to present his case effectively. The sub-postmaster should not detain post office papers or allow them out of his custody for the purpose of such consultation without the permission of the retail network manager. Can you assist us with the purpose of that provision?
I think the view internally was that at that stage it was purely a private contractual dispute between us and the postmaster, and that there was a process internally to manage that. Once that process had exhausted, of course, it would have been open for the postmaster to take whatever course of action they thought was appropriate if they felt that the outcome of the case was unsafe or unfair.
Who is it preventing a sub-postmaster from making contact with?
Or anyone outside of the company, really.
We discussed earlier the problems involved with the inability for sub-postmasters to find out about similar problems that other sub-postmasters were experiencing. Do you see this provision as causing any issues in that regard?
Well, it may or would make them think that, you know, they were having to deal with this in a sort of silo almost, and that they weren't able to openly discuss the circumstances of the case with other people or share information with other people.
Do you recall any cases that you were involved in that were overturned on appeal?
I think when I was a contracts manager, there was one case that was heard by Lynn Norbury, who was an appeals manager at the time, that was overturned.
So that's one case in a 2-3 year period?
In a 2 or 3 year period, I think there was some information internally that said, I think around 10% of appeals were upheld. You know,
but in terms of your personal experience and personal knowledge, you're only aware of one?
I can only recall one that would happened in like a 3 year period, but I can't remember how many terminations that I would have been involved in over that period.
That's when you were the contract manager, but what about when you were sitting on the appeals? Did you ever overturn an appeal?
No.
I'm going to move on to what...
I think you meant uphold an appeal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
No.
sorry. Thank you. I'm going to move on to what happens when you've been terminated, when your contract has been terminated. Can we look at POL 00075610, please? This is a 2009 policy where you are the author.
Yeah.
You're named as the author. Do you recall writing this or being responsible for it?
Yeah, I've got some recollection of, you know, looking at that document now. Yeah.
Do you think you wrote it?
Yeah, I would have authored that approach. Yeah, it's got my name on it. Yeah.
If we look at the bottom of the page, it explains what the change is. It says, for agents who have had their contracts summarily terminated by Post Office Limited, or who, in our opinion, have resigned to avoid termination, it's important that we're open with them in communicating the possible outcome of that decision in respect of what type of post office operating model, if any, we determine is appropriate in the locality.
Yeah.
One of these outcomes may be the deployment of a different operating model, e.g. Post Office Essentials, to that currently used. And it says on that final paragraph on the screen, it's important to note here that sub-postmasters do not have any right of assignment of their post office business, so any inquiries in that respect should be managed using the normal reactive lines, etc. Can you assist us with what this all means?
Well, this is in the context of like a set-piece business transformation program where the business had developed different type of post office operating model. I think the document refers to Post Office Essentials, which was a forerunner of the local post office model that was implemented as part of the network transformation program. So the purpose of the document was to say that in the event of termination or resignation to avoid termination, we need to be open with the outgoing postmaster that it may not be the case that a traditional contract, a post office with a traditional contract, is deployed in that location. Because clearly an outgoing postmaster would be perhaps advertising their retail business for sale with the concession of a post office within it. So it was necessary for them to understand what type of post office so that they could inform any potential buyer.
So might it be that a sub-postmaster's contract is terminated, they're then left with a post office, and they need to find another sub-postmaster, sell it, etc. And this document is telling them, or is outlining the position that actually they might be left with something
different to what was there. Yeah.
Typically something less than what was there. I mean, Post Office Essential sounds perhaps smaller, or
I think the remuneration aspect was different in Post Office Essentials because it was on a fully variable basis. So on a traditional contract, the sub-postmaster would receive a fixed payment plus a variable payment. On the more modern operating models, it was on a fully variable basis. It's quite an important distinction if you're thinking about buying a business that has a post office in it.
So potentially less profitable.
But potentially, yeah.
If we're thinking about implications for sub-postmasters once their contract's been terminated, are we to read into this document that not only would they lose their contract, but they might suffer financial harm because their post office is less sellable than it perhaps was before their termination?
Yeah, it's quite possible, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to look at a few other policies. I'll take them quite quickly. They address issues such as suspension and contract breach, for example. Can we look at Pol 00005933? This is a 2012 policy, precautionary suspension policy. I think you've mentioned before precautionary suspension. Can you briefly summarise for us what precautionary suspension was?
Well, that would normally be where there had been a bad audit with a significant discrepancy, and there would need to be a process following that. So a precautionary suspension may be the most appropriate thing to do at the time.
And we see there you're the owner of that
That's correct.
particular policy. Could we turn to page 3, please? And it's 3.3. It says there, the post office may consider it to be in its interests to suspend the operator of a post office branch if it deems that there's a risk to its brand and reputation, cash or stock, in the interest of our customers. 3.13, so over the page to page 4, says, during the period of any suspension, the post office will cease all payments to the suspended operator. So am I to understand that a sub-postmaster may be suspended on a precautionary basis, and the result of that is that the post office will stop paying the sub-postmaster?
That's correct, but what would happen in that case is that we would seek to appoint a temporary postmaster to operate from the premises. He would negotiate some payment with the suspended agent for the consideration for using the premises, and then the remuneration would go to the temporary postmaster.
Thank you. Another policy, Pol 000861116. This is the guiding principles for suspension. So that's substantive suspension, is it, rather than precautionary suspension?
I think there was only precautionary suspension.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Were you involved in the drafting of this document?
What was the date of the...
I don't think this document is
No,
dated.
sorry.
If we could zoom out, please.
Okay. Is it possible to have a 5-minute comfort break?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
So could we break until 10 past 12? Or
Okay,
should we say quarter past 12? We have plenty of time today.
thank you. Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Inwood, one final policy before I move on to two very small discrete issues. It is Pol 000888475. This is a 2014 policy with you named as the owner, and it's entitled Contract Breach. Can you just briefly assist us with how this policy fits in with the various policies that we've already seen?
I think this was probably the most recent iteration of the policy, and I think it was at the request of Angela van den Boogaard. She was the sponsor of this work, so it was just something that I worked up with legal services, really, that was deployed into the contracts community.
Thank you. Page 2, it sets out at the very top the purpose. Does that assist you in its purpose?
Yeah.
This policy and the previous policies that we've seen today, am I right in saying that there was nothing in those policies about how to deal with situations where there are bugs, errors or defects in the system?
No.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a different topic, and that's involvement in criminal and civil proceedings. I think you said in your statement that it was rare to receive contact from lawyers and that you played no part in criminal prosecutions and don't have recollection of civil cases.
Criminal cases.
Of criminal cases. Now, I can show you a number of different documents, but perhaps I'll just ask you the open question as to whether you've reconsidered that position since you've seen documents.
I can recall one particular case, I think when I was a contracts manager, 2002, 2004. I think it was some contact from John L. Singh, who was involved in the criminal prosecutions team. But it was only that. It was just to inform me of progress and to find out progress with the contractual case. There may be others that I wasn't able to recall when I completed the witness statement course.
Did you ever give evidence in criminal proceedings?
Only when I was a branch manager in the Crown Office estate and a case of a poll employee. And I think I was called to give evidence in one other case as an expert witness. I think it was a postmaster, something that I wasn't directly involved in.
When you say an expert witness, in what way were you an
That could provide an insight into branch accounting procedures. It was to do with an issue of something that was known as British excursionary document, and they were being issued inappropriately to members of the public. So I think the court just needed to know what the correct procedure was in terms of validating a person's identification.
And was the post office a party to that case?
I can't remember if they were the prosecuting authority, no.
Because you've described yourself as an expert. Did you know the difference between an expert witness and somebody who isn't an expert witness?
Someone who isn't an expert witness wouldn't know a great deal about the subject, and I did know a great deal about the subject, so that's why I describe myself in that way. Yeah.
Was it ever, were you ever told by anybody in the post office legal team, for example, about the duties to a court that an expert witness owes?
No, I don't think there was any discussion. I think it was the post office investigation team that had asked me to appear. It was an odd one because it just wasn't a case I've been directly involved in.
Do you recall who in the post office investigation
No,
team?
that was a long time ago when I was a branch manager, so I think it was probably sometime in the 1990s.
Thank you. I'll take you to a few documents very quickly. Can we look at poll 000865582, please? This is a discussion with somebody called Victoria Brooks, who's an associate at Bond Pierce, about a case that involved a branch called Newcastleton branch. And it's halfway down the page, she says there, you've seen my emails with Roderick and Paul Inwood regarding the interview process, where this comes from and whether it is necessary. Paul has said that these points will be picked up as part of a review that is imminent. So for now, I've proceeded on the basis that the post office wants to allow the opportunity for an interview to take place. Can you assist us? Does this assist you with the types of occasion when you would come into contact with lawyers?
Well, I was working with legal services very closely all of the time, so it wasn't something that was odd for me to have emails from legal services about individual cases.
Can we please also have a look at poll 000724146? And it's the second page here. There's an email from Mandy Talbot to, you're copied into an email from Mandy Talbot. It's about the Marine Drive post office. That's a post office that was previously run by Lee Castleton. And she says, it's about halfway down the page, given the problems we've had with Castleton, I would have thought that the post office would be happy if a prospective permanent postmaster had come along. Can the BDM or contract manager for the relevant part of the country advise whether or not she ever applied for the position at Marine Drive or another branch, and if so, what the response was? Does this assist you in recalling what, if any, involvement you had with the legal case against Lee Castleton or what followed that case?
No, I think this was an issue around a temporary postmaster, and there was some, from when I read this earlier, there was some issue around whether they would receive a termination payment, which clearly wasn't appropriate for a temporary postmaster. And I think there was concerns about the fact that she felt that she was entitled to such a payment.
So would you be consulted by the legal team about contractual matters involving sub-postmasters?
From time to time, yeah, in the context of a civil case, yeah.
Do you recall Mandy Talbot?
I'm familiar with the name, and I think perhaps she was involved in criminal prosecution side. I'm not entirely sure.
If we look at the email, it has on the next page Mandy Talbot Dispute Resolution Company Secretary's Office. Does that assist you? Do you recall, for example, how senior she was or how senior you understood her to be?
I think she was probably around the level of principal lawyer, around the same level as Jessica Madron.
And what did you understand by the term principal lawyer?
Well, not a paralegal, or, you know, someone who had direct reports, you know, solicitor working for them, or some, you know, job titles tend to be determined by whether you had direct reports or not.
Direct reports to who, sorry?
Into them.
Yes.
So she may have had a solicitor working for her, or a paralegal, you know.
In your understanding of that legal team, looking at this or recalling from this discussion about the Lee Castleton case, can you give us your understanding of whether she was a caseworker or something more significant?
I can't recall.
No.
Sorry.
Can we look at poll 000414427, please? Page 2. An email from Paul Inwood, from yourself to Jessica Madron and Roderick Williams. And it says, if we could scroll down, sorry. We'll need your help with this case, please, as there's an indication that it may be heading towards litigation. Does that assist you at all in your involvement in litigation against sub-postmasters and the role that you had?
I think it would be very infrequent, if at all. As I said to you earlier, the whole management of the civil aspect of a dispute was sort of in a silo from any criminal prosecution. I don't believe anyone would come to me for advice about how to manage a criminal prosecution, but would come to me for advice about how to manage the civil aspect of a case.
The inquiries heard evidence suggesting that actions taken by contract managers, for example, in some way formed part of a prosecution case against a sub-postmaster. Were you aware of the actions that you were taking as contract manager?
No, it was the opposite to that. As I said earlier, I don't think there was any nexus between the two. You know, I was trained to treat the civil aspect of a case entirely separately from the criminal aspect of a case. That's because the burden of proof in the two is completely different. And as I said earlier, it was very rare for me to, in the context of the whole number of cases that would cross my desk, would be to hear about the criminal aspect of a case as opposed to the civil aspect.
Were you aware that information that you gathered, for example, might subsequently be used in a criminal prosecution?
I can't think any of the examples where it was, because in the context of a civil aspect of the case, I can't recall being asked to provide any evidence.
Would you have known if information that you gathered as part of your processes was subsequently used in a...
Not necessarily, because once the case had been put to bed, you know, the paperwork would be retained for 6 or 7 years in the ex-postmaster's papers, and I guess it would have been possible for someone looking at the criminal prosecution to call those papers in and look at them. But I wouldn't have been alerted to that fact had it happened.
The final topic I have is Second Sight. You say in your statement that you had no involvement with Second Sight.
Yeah.
You've subsequently seen some documentation. Does that assist you at all?
I've seen documentation where I was copied in to either an email or a document that was being developed to inform the response to Second Sight.
Perhaps I can show you poll 000222167. If we go to the final page here, page 4, has your name there, 2014.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
And if we look at the first page, it explains what it is. Second Sight mediation briefing report. Do you remember writing this report?
No.
It may be difficult to say why you don't remember it, but it wasn't so long ago. 2014.
Well, it was nearly 10 years ago.
Yes. Is there a reason why issues relating to second sight you can't recall, certainly haven't detailed in your witness statement?
It was something I was aware of, and it's clearly something I've helped draft a response to, but it's not something that really stuck in the mind, really.
Perhaps if we could look at poll 000218853. It's an email of 27th of August 2014. You're listed there as a copy recipient. If we could have a look, scroll out a little bit, thank you very much. It's an email chain commenting on Second Sight's Part 2 report. Why might you have been included in that email distribution list?
Why would I have been?
Yes.
Because someone believed I needed to see it. But if they were asking for a specific comment, I think that would be different.
Do you know why you, in your particular role at that particular time, may have been included in the distribution list? Looking at the names there, for example, what is it that you might have added, or why you might have needed to see that?
I think it was, as I said earlier, it was quite common for me to be copied into email chains for anything pertaining to postmasters as a sort of comfort blanket. You know, in case I could read it and think of something where it added value to the conversation in the email.
Do you recall reading the Second Sight Part 2 report?
No.
There are other emails, there are two other emails, I can give the references, I won't bring them up on screen. Poll 000218883 and poll 000222240. Again, you're part of a small distribution list that is addressing the Second Sight Part 2 report. It's not something that you recall discussing with anybody at the time?
Not really, no, not at all.
It didn't form... I mean, look at the names. Were they people who you had regular conversations with?
The whole Second Sight thing, I think it was tend to be managed in a silo by legal services. Obviously, I've been copied into email chains, but it's something that I could add very little value to. So I didn't take a huge interest in what was going on.
Who in particular? You say legal services?
I think the General Counsel, Susan Crichton, who I think was instructed to appoint Second Sight. Generally, some fairly senior lawyers were involved in that.
The Second Sight report contained some aspects that were critical about the Horizon system.
It did.
This is 2014. We started today with that 2018 interview with the solicitors where, you'll recall, Horizon's a calculator, no problems, etc., etc. Is it slightly strange that it didn't have feature more prominently in discussions with you and those individuals?
I think that there was a narrative that was beginning to develop in the company that was quite dismissive and unhappy with some of the findings that the Second Sight had arrived at, and it's not really what they wanted.
And who in particular?
I think that around that point, the General Counsel left the company quite quickly, Susan Crichton.
And other than what you've read in the media subsequently, is there anything that you knew at that time or know now as to the reasons for her departure?
I think internally there was some time after there was a feeling that she felt that she was being blamed for the developments with Second Sight. When General Counsel leaves the company quite rapidly, clearly there's a reason for that.
And were there any discussions you had in that regard?
No, I wouldn't. That wouldn't have been at my level. I'm referring to anecdotes within the organisation that I overheard.
And you've said that there was unhappiness about that Second Sight report. Was that from her or directed towards her?
I think it was the latter.
And who would be directing it towards her?
Probably people at Exco level.
Can you assist us with that?
I think it may have been Paula Venables.
And is that through any particular knowledge, any particular discussions with anybody? How is it that you reach that conclusion?
Overhearing anecdotes and conversations internally, sometime after the fact.
Can you give us an approximate time for those?
Well, it's difficult to approximate when.
We know you left in 2018, so presumably it was in between 2014 and 2018.
Correct.
Thank you. So I don't have any further questions. I know Mr. Steen has a small number of questions. Do you, sir, have any questions before Mr. Steen?
Can you hear me, Mr. Blake?
I can, yes.
Fine. Because there's a glitch on the IT on my side of this. I can't mute or unmute myself. Anyway, I'll remain on unmute. I haven't got any questions. No, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Steen.
Mr. Inwood, my name is Sam Steen. I represent a large number of sub-postmasters and sub-postmaster mistresses. Just that last point you've been discussing with Mr. Blake about the second site and the second site report. Your answer to him a few minutes ago was that in agreement with him, was that the second site report raised concerns, and your answer to him was it did. Now, help us understand a little bit more about your evidence about this. You were aware of the contents of the second site report when it came out?
I don't believe that I ever read it.
So is this in the same way that you've discussed with Mr. Blake the fact that there was discussion within the company about such things?
There was corridor talk.
Corridor talk.
Around
Right.
the fact that company not too happy with the way it was going.
Well, the second site report did set out that there had been defects and difficulties within the Horizon system, that those had been noted and that there were problems to a certain extent based upon the information it had at the time. So the second site report seems to have been discussed amongst people in the corridors, as you say, with knowledge that it was showing some defects in the system. Is that fair?
I believe so, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the reason why I ask you that is that at paragraph 98 of your statement, and so the statement is WITN 05780-100, paragraph 98, page 17 of 28, that you talk about during the final year of your service, I had heard that it was possible for Fujitsu engineers to gain backdoor access into the system without the knowledge of sub-postmasters. You then go on to say that did give me some cause for concern, as I had previously heard a rebuttal to this internally. Next sentence. That aside, I was not aware of any concerns regarding the robustness of the Horizon system. Now, your last year of service, unless I've got this wrong, was 2018, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So the sentence there that it says, that aside, I was not aware of any concerns regarding the robustness of the Horizon system. It's not true, is it?
Not from postmasters. When I completed that statement, I was thinking in terms of specific examples from postmasters regarding flaws in the Horizon system.
Well, let's read onwards. That aside, I was not aware of any concerns regarding the robustness of the Horizon system. I'd used the system myself on occasions over a long period of time, and it appeared to work well. I had not seen any evidence that it was not working well. I'd heard of a campaign by the Justice for Sub-Postmasters group. However, we were assured internally that the system was sound. Well, you had concerns brought to your attention in corridor discussions,
Well, they weren't brought to my...
relayed in relation to and discussion in relation
They,
to
they weren't
the
brought to my...
second site report.
Yeah, but I'm referring to anecdotes internally regarding some disquiet about second site generally. I'd not uncovered any specific examples that demonstrated to me that there were flaws in the system.
Well, let's just nail this down. Why did you say at paragraph 98 that you were not aware of any concerns regarding the robustness of the Horizon system?
Yeah,
When in fact you knew, going back in time to the second site report, in corridor discussions, that it was raising concerns. Mr.
I think people were being dismissive about the findings of second site. And the narrative internally was that, you know, these are forensic accountants, not lawyers. How could they have concerns with regards to the fairness of the contracts? You know, in the statement I'm talking about the fact that I wasn't aware that there were specific examples brought to my attention directly regarding the integrity of the system.
Well, Mr. Inwood, what it says is I was not aware of any concerns.
Yeah, I understand
When
that.
concerns are being raised.
Well, let me elaborate.
Well, why didn't you actually get it right in your statement and actually say, well, I was aware of
Well-
problems in the second site report, but in fact I was told by X or Y to ignore it?
Well, I've made it clear to you now.
Now, you also mentioned in your evidence about, you said something about the Tier 1 helpline.
Mm.
And you described it in this way, that you were discussing with Mr. Blake the fact that the helpline didn't seem to have much by way of operational discretion. And you spoke about sticking to scripts.
Mm.
Okay. Now, help us please understand, how many tiers operated in the helpline?
I don't know.
Well-
I wasn't directly involved in that area of the business.
Well, we know there's Tier 1. That seems to suppose there's more than one tier.
Yeah, but you asked me how many, and I'm not aware of that.
Well, all right. What did the other tiers other than Tier 1 do?
I don't know. I wasn't directly involved in that part of the business. Tier 1 would refer issues that they could not deal with up the chain of command to Tier 2 and beyond, if there was a beyond.
Right. So you didn't have any information about what maybe Tier 2, 3, 4,
Well,
5?
that wasn't a sphere of the business that I had any involvement or oversight with, no. And it would change from time to time in business reorganisation, so no.
Okay. Can we have on the screen, please, Paul, this is a document looked earlier, Paul, 4 zeros, followed by 4 sixes. Page 46, please. And roughly middle of the page, where we see a VB 64.8. Right.
Yeah.
So if you could highlight, please, Julie. Thank you very much. You see where it's just been kindly highlighted at VB 64.8. Now, this is the discussion that you had. It's saying this. Is Post Office should communicate or alternatively not conceal known problems, bugs or errors in or generated by Horizon that might have financial and other resulting implications for claimants?
Mm.
Okay, right. Now, with all due acceptance that that particular sentence is being written down perhaps as it's said conversationally, then your answer. I agree entirely. And if we did do that, it would be entirely inconsistent with our values as an organisation. I do not believe that any individual or individuals would do that in this organisation. Mm. Okay. So help us understand what you're saying here. Are you saying there that you felt that the organisational values were not to keep back or hold back information about the operation of the Horizon system, errors, bugs and problems?
I think generally the values of the organisation will be to be open, transparent and honest at that point in time.
What point in time are you talking about?
At the point in time that I made that statement, which is in 2008.
Year before? Completely dishonest and wouldn't trust them an inch?
No, at that point in time and before that.
Right, so you're saying generally that's your view of the system.
Of the organisation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, at the bottom of the page, please, 6410, I think it is. Right, here we go, yes. So again, highlight please VB 6410, just thank you very much. And this is a reference not to conceal from claimants post office's ability to alter remotely data or transactions upon which the calculation of the branch accounts and any discrepancy or alleged shortfall is depended. I'm not sure whether you would comment on that or are not sure about that, question mark. And then your answer, I'm aware why this has been put in there, but I cannot comment on whether we do have the ability to do that or not. I suspect it goes back to a rogue individual in Fujitsu saying that they could not manipulate and individuals' agents' accounts. I do not know whether this is true or not. Okay? All right, so we've got two parts of the same page. One, you saying you think that the ethos of the post office is good and that no doubt bugs and errors, if found, would be discussed. And secondly, regarding altering the system, you didn't know about any ability to do that other than some bloke in or some person in Fujitsu.
At that point in time.
At that point in time,
Yeah.
okay. And then in your statement, just as a reminder, you say this, the paragraph we've looked at, during the final year of my service, I had heard that it was possible for Fujitsu engineers to gain backdoor access into the system without the knowledge of sub-postmasters. That did give me some cause for concern, as I had previously heard a rebuttal to this internally. Okay, let's add two things together. This possibility that you talk about in your statement for Fujitsu engineers to gain backdoor access to the system without the knowledge of sub-postmasters, where did you get that idea from that you talk about in paragraph 98?
It's something that I heard after the witness proofing statement. So in the first quarter of 2018, I think.
Right.
So after I made the statement.
Right. That you go on to say, did give me some cause for concern, as I had previously heard a rebuttal to this internally. Who did you hear the rebuttal from?
It was a rumour internally that a senior manager had rebuked someone else for suggesting that it was possible for Fujitsu engineers to access the system remotely.
Forgive me for interrupting, Mr. Inwood. The senior manager being...
Alwyn Lyons, the company secretary.
Say it again?
Alwyn Lyons, the
Alwyn.
company secretary.
Right. Okay. Now, I'm going to take you to another document, please, which is FUJ 000-81584. Okay. Now, I don't believe you've had this before, but it relates to the evidence you've given on these two matters. Can we just go through who we've got here? This document is a 2010 document, okay? And it relates to receipts / payments mismatch issue notes, as you'll see in the middle.
Mr. Steen, sorry to interrupt, but is this a document that was in the Rule 10 request?
No. It arises out of the answers that the witness has given.
If Mr. Inwood hasn't seen it, I think he should have an opportunity to see the entire document. It may be that we can do all of that before lunch, but I do ask, sir, perhaps we can...
Well, this is all very interesting, but the truth is that we now know absolutely that it was possible for Fujitsu to access the system remotely, and I'm not quite sure that exploring this with a witness for whom this must have been peripheral in the extreme during the course of his work is going to get me very far, Mr. Steen.
Can I try and shorten it then and put it in two different ways other than the document? Okay? Can we take the document down? Mr. Inwood, in 2010, the document that I was about to show you, if you'd have been aware of such issues, was discussing what's called a mismatch bug. It's a bug that affected branches. It infiltrated a branch to the extent that you couldn't tell that there's something gone wrong, but in fact there was a shortfall. Okay? So completely submarine-like for sub-postmasters. Were you, in your terms of employment, made aware of any such bug that have a devastating effect upon post office branches?
No.
No. Secondly, the document goes on at the very end to talk about the fact that Fujitsu can alter branch accounts through a back door. This is in 2010. Were you aware of that?
No, not in 2010.
Do you think you should have been told about such issues?
I think anyone that was managing contractual issues with the postmaster should have been aware of that. Yeah. Because it introduces the possibility that the evidence that they're using to determine a contract is unsafe.
And the fact that a bug, a mismatch bug that operates in the way I've described in 2010 rather undermines what you've said about there being a good ethos of openness about bugs and errors within the post office, doesn't it?
The flaws in software, bugs, backdoor access to the system should not be a secret in the company, because as I've just said, it introduces the possibility that contracts were being determined, or worse, based on the possibly unsafe evidence. It's difficult to say anyone could arrive at any other conclusion than that.
So no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
So is
sir.
that-
There are no further questions.
Right. So how are we looking in respect of this afternoon, Mr. Blake?
We're absolutely fine. This afternoon's witness will not be particularly long, perhaps an hour. So
Right.
perhaps if we could come back in 1 hour's time, so 10 to 2.
Yeah, that's fine. And hopefully I'll be able to solve the mystery of why I can't mute myself anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.